The air in West Africa shifted, not with war drums, nor with headlines, but with 9 quiet words that stunned the very room meant to control them. There is undeniable progress in Burkina Faso. A sentence so brief it could vanish in a breath, yet it landed like thunder. The chairman of ECOWAS, a body once feared for its power to sanction, suspend, and scold, stood before diplomats, many of whom had written off the nation as a lost cause and confessed they were wrong. This was the same Burkina Faso they had warned would collapse, the same people they had punished for refusing orders. And now, the world watches them rise. Under the quiet leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a movement is unfolding, not just of policy, but of purpose. Markets reopen, schools rebirth, roads stretch toward tomorrow, all without foreign hands guiding the way. Stay with us, this isn't just about Burkina Faso. It's about every African voice once silenced. Subscribe and walk with us because this new rhythm of resistance might just be the music of our future. What changed? And what storm brews behind those 9 words? It began in a room no one remembers. Not a grand hall of flags and flashbulbs, but a modest chamber thick with protocol and routine. The kind of place where diplomacy usually goes to die, drowned in rehearsed statements, half smiles, and nods too empty to mean anything. And then it happened. The chairman of ECOWAS leaned forward, not in grandeur, not with a prepared statement, but with a phrase that cut the air in half. There is undeniable progress in Burkina Faso. No applause, no rebuttal, just a hush. And in that hush, the weight of the old world cracked. Why did it matter? Because this was not merely a comment, it was a confession. A reckoning. A subtle but seismic shift in how West Africa's power dynamics are understood. ECOWAS, long regarded as the continent's enforcer of Western-aligned norms, had just publicly acknowledged success in a nation it had tried to strangle with sanctions. For context, this was the same ECOWAS that, in early 2022, issued travel bans, froze financial assets, and suspended Burkina Faso's membership. Their reason? The military-led transition under Captain Ibrahim Traoré was deemed illegitimate, risky, and unsustainable. Echoes of another failed state rang through Western media. Forecasts of chaos circulated with academic precision, but they were wrong. Fast forward to late 2023, the same Burkina Faso, led by the same captain, stood stronger, not weaker. Not only had the government not collapsed, but it had begun building, not just restoring order, but reimagining it. Schools reopened in once abandoned zones. Markets buzzed again. Infrastructure projects emerged, not funded by international donors, but by local ingenuity and collective will. And it was in this context that the ECOWAS chairman made his remark. Observers thought it might be a mistake, a diplomatic blunder. But what followed proved otherwise. That sentence was not retracted. It was repeated, and then dissected in international circles from Abuja to Brussels. Because its implications were too vast to ignore, let us pause and reflect. Why would an institution that spent years punishing Burkina Faso suddenly acknowledge progress? Was it fatigue, a shift in internal consensus, or something deeper? The realization that reality on the ground had outpaced the rhetoric of control. In fact, the moment had been building. Weeks earlier, ECOWAS officials had toured parts of Ouagadougou and the surrounding regions. They visited hydroelectric plants run by local engineers. They walked markets humming with activity, where women sold cassava and millet grown by their own cooperatives. They observed classrooms where chalk dust floated through the air like revolution, and not one wall bore the logo of a foreign NGO. No aid, no imported vision, just people doing for themselves. That's what cracked the narrative. Burkina Faso wasn't supposed to survive, let alone thrive. It had defied the textbook on how post-coup nations behave. Instead of spiraling into tyranny or economic ruin, it found rhythm in resilience, and that rhythm could no longer be ignored. The statement, undeniable progress, was therefore not an accident. It was a measured release, a subtle pivot from condemnation to concession. A way for ECOWAS to save face while acknowledging that the rules had changed, that perhaps the very model of African governance they had policed was no longer working. Of course, the phrase alone didn't change policy. Sanctions remained. But something more powerful had shifted: perception. For every young Burkinabe watching at home, that 9-word sentence sounded like a drumbeat of validation. For every elder who had survived decades of foreign interference, it sounded like justice long delayed. For the continent, it signaled that the future may no longer be dictated in Paris or Washington, but in the streets of Ouagadougou. So the world asked, what changed? The answer is layered. Yes, there was leadership, focused, non-theatrical, grounded in outcomes rather than optics. Yes, there was a population willing to endure hardship in the name of dignity. But more than that, there was a rejection, a refusal to accept that African progress must always be certified by external powers. That's what the chairman saw. That's what made him speak. And in doing so, he did more than make a statement. He triggered a storm. Not of protest, but of possibility. Because if one nation, landlocked and sanctioned, could achieve undeniable progress, then every narrative about Africa's fragility must now be re-examined. But why now? And what made even the harshest critics admit defeat? The air inside the room had barely returned to stillness when reports began filtering out, not of a grand announcement, but of silence. A silence so loud it echoed beyond walls and borders. What followed the ECOWAS chairman's 9-word declaration wasn't applause. It was disturbance. Diplomatic pens hovered mid-air. Eyes darted across tables. Some sat back in disbelief. Others leaned forward, trying to mask their unease with professional restraint. Because what he said was not just a phrase. It was a rupture. A rupture in a narrative long upheld by external powers and their local partners. For decades, the formula was simple. Nations like Burkina Faso were deemed unstable unless guided, unless funded, coached, disciplined. Any deviation from the international rulebook was punished swiftly, usually by sanctions or silence. And yet here was a nation battered by isolation, finding its feet and walking. And what ECOWAS had seen in the weeks leading up to that moment was undeniable indeed. In the outskirts of Ouagadougou, they witnessed a hydroelectric facility humming with life, designed, built, and operated not by foreign contractors, but by young engineers from Burkina Faso, many under the age of 30. These weren't students finishing international fellowships. They were locals who had stayed, trained, and delivered. Energy once dependent on fragile external grids now surged from a river tamed by Burkinabe mines. Further on, a once war-torn market square revealed its own story. There, in the very space where bullet casings once littered the ground, baskets now overflowed with cassava, millet, yams, and peanuts. Gone were the rows of foreign aid crates. In their place, women haggled over prices, their voices rising with pride, not desperation. Children ran between stalls, not fleeing but laughing. The ECOWAS delegation walked through rows of new schools. No donor logos, no foreign flags, just brick and chalk and dreams, walls painted by local hands, curriculums drafted by local educators, classrooms led by teachers who had once fled insecurity but had now returned. It wasn't perfect, but it was alive. This was not charity. This was not recovery according to someone else's metrics. This was something far more subversive to the old order. It was self-reliance. And that's what unsettled the observers most. Because the entire doctrine of external oversight depends on a single persistent belief that without outside help, Africa will fail. But here was proof otherwise, tangible, measurable, in plain sight. More quietly, they noticed what wasn't there. No convoy of white SUVs with diplomatic plates. No swarm of international consultants with clipboards and daily allowances. No glossy reports outlining what Africans must do next. What there was instead was the pulse of a people reclaiming authorship. A diplomat from Senegal whispered to a colleague, "If they can pull this off, what will we say at the next summit?" He wasn't asking for analysis. He was voicing fear. Because what's truly dangerous to the old world order isn't rebellion, it's a working alternative. And Burkina Faso was becoming just that. The chairman's words had not been rehearsed. In fact, aides later confirmed he had gone off script. No one knew he would say it. But once said, it could not be taken back. The quote raced through newsrooms. It rippled across African Twitter. It was dissected on WhatsApp groups among students and soldiers alike. For some, it was a moment of relief. For others, a moment of reckoning. especially among those in power elsewhere in West Africa who had stood shoulder to shoulder with the sanctioning bloc. They now had to decide, double down on a failing consensus or reconsider. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was something else entirely. It was vindication. For the mothers who had fed their children during blackouts. For the farmers who had sold crops without subsidies. For the teachers who had held class under trees. For the engineers who had worked without international praise. That simple statement, undeniable progress, wasn't diplomacy. It was justice. And what came next only deepened the tremor. Crowds began gathering in Ouagadougou, not to protest, but to celebrate. Not in defiance, but in affirmation. Portraits of Captain Ibrahim Traoré waved like banners, not as propaganda, but as gratitude. Homemade signs read, "Our dignity is not for sale." Children wore T-shirts with chalk slogans printed across their chests. "We do not wait to be saved." Television cameras from neighboring countries picked up the images. In Ghana, in Nigeria, and Côte d'Ivoire, viewers watched, stunned, as a sanctioned country not only survived but smiled. And within ECOWAS itself, the debate erupted. Could they really continue to blacklist a country that was clearly making strides? Could they ignore the groundswell of support rising not just within Burkina Faso, but across the Sahel? And if progress can be built without permission, what power truly remains in the hands of old gatekeepers? Sanctions were meant to suffocate. That was their design. The invisible weapon of choice for modern empires. No bullets, no bombs, just travel bans, blocked reserves, suspended aid. Quiet punishments meant to bend the will of a state until it begged for forgiveness. But in Burkina Faso, the opposite happened. Instead of collapse, the sanctions triggered something unexpected. A groundswell of ingenuity and defiance. Where Western analysts predicted riots, there were rallies. Where economists warned of famine, farmers found new soil. And where politicians forecasted isolation, new alliances bloomed. In the markets of Bobo Dioulasso, traders adjusted prices daily, not in CFA francs alone, but in local arrangements, bartering networks, and mobile credit lines. Salt from Mauritania, rice from Guinea, second-hand textiles rerouted through Togo, each item a rebellion against dependency. Informal corridors of trade, long dormant, were revived with purpose and precision. And across the Sahel, whispers turned into policies. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, three nations once described as fragile states, signed mutual defense pacts and began negotiations to move beyond the CFA franc. The very tool once hailed as stabilizing, the French-backed currency, was now viewed as a colonial leash. New conversations emerged around regional currency, shared infrastructure, and joint production chains. But the most profound impact of sanctions wasn't economic. It was psychological. For decades, African populations were taught, through media, education, and policy, that survival required outside help. That stability depended on someone else's approval. That development was something measured by donors, not by dignity. But sanctions changed the script. By cutting the ties, they forced a question no longer avoidable. What if we stopped waiting to be rescued? And in answering that question, something stirred. In the remote village of Djibo, school teachers gathered under baobab trees to redesign a curriculum from scratch, one that spoke in local tongues, used native metaphors, and taught children about their land before Parisian philosophers. The slogan scribbled across every blackboard was bold and contagious. We do not wait to be saved. We learn to save ourselves. This wasn't mere rhetoric. Textbooks were printed locally. Class sessions were recorded on cheap radios powered by solar panels. Volunteers cycled between villages with chalkboards strapped to their backs. In many areas, enrollment doubled within a year. Women, too often cast aside in power structures, found new space. In the northern provinces, grain cooperatives led by female elders brought surplus harvests for the first time in decades. Instead of aid trucks, food was moved by donkey carts painted with slogans like, "Our hands feed our future." The government, under the steady stewardship of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, didn't chase perfection. It chased functionality. Ministries were downsized but reactivated. Local councils, long ignored, began managing budgets for roads, water pumps, and waste collection. No glamour, just grit. And slowly, order emerged. Public employees returned to work. Security posts were rebuilt with sandbags and courage. In areas once ruled by fear, children walked home without escort. The message from the top was clear. Sovereignty was not a speech, it was a service. The international media struggled to report this. Their lenses were trained for famine and firefights. But how does one cover quiet progress? How do you headline dignity? Instead, it was the people themselves who told the story. Through WhatsApp videos of school plays, through Facebook live streams of market reopenings, through graffiti that read, "Not help us, but see us." And what followed was even more startling. Ordinary citizens in neighboring countries began asking questions. Why do we still depend on foreign consultants for policies? Why must our budgets be approved by institutions in Brussels or Washington? Why is it unthinkable to build for ourselves? These questions, once dangerous, became dinner table conversations. Across West Africa, a quiet rebellion of thought was growing. But the implications didn't stop there. Within ECOWAS itself, younger diplomats began drafting internal memos questioning the effectiveness of punishment-based diplomacy. Senior officials grumbled that the bloc had lost moral authority. After all, if the very tools of pressure no longer bend nations, what remains of the hand that holds them? The bloc that once disciplined now stood divided. Because Burkina Faso had not just survived, it had dared to define its own terms. And in doing so, it shattered the illusion that African independence was symbolic only. If you believe Africa's strength has always been there, just waiting to be unleashed, leave a rise in the comments below. But this rise is not just national, it's regional. What happened next changed the map. While the streets of Ouagadougou pulsed with renewed energy, the corridors of Washington, Paris, and Brussels were far less jubilant. Behind closed doors, analysts scrambled to reframe their assessments. The usual narratives about instability, about authoritarian drift, about inevitable collapse no longer fit. Burkina Faso was not crumbling. It was recalibrating. And more troublingly for Western capitals, it was inspiring. The United States, long a key backer of ECOWAS, found itself in a bind. Its policy frameworks in West Africa had hinged on alliances with traditional institutions, treating regional blocs as proxies for influence. Sanctions were coordinated. Aid was conditional. Diplomacy flowed through filtered channels. But now those channels were leaking. The very bloc once trusted to maintain order had admitted disruption. The chairman's phrase, "undeniable progress," echoed far louder in think tanks than in headlines. Because it was more than a slip, it was a signal. A signal that even within ECOWAS, the grip of the old consensus was loosening. European diplomats, particularly in France, were rattled for a different reason. For them, Burkina Faso represented not just a nation, but a symbol, a former colony that had dared to walk off script. The expulsion of French troops from the country had already stung. Now, watching that same country stabilize on its own terms was politically radioactive. Meanwhile, new actors began circling. Russia and Turkey, long marginal in Sahelian affairs, seized the moment. Humanitarian deals, military training offers, and economic cooperation proposals were drafted with remarkable speed. Where the West saw a vacuum, others saw opportunity. But not every outside power sought domination. Some African nations, Guinea, Algeria, even Kenya, began to engage with Burkina Faso as an equal partner, bypassing old diplomatic norms. They offered trade, not aid, collaboration, not correction. This shift in tone was subtle but historic, and within international institutions the ripple effects grew. At the United Nations, debates around peacekeeping and sanctions took on a new tenor. How can a sanctioned country outperform expectations? How do you continue to justify financial restrictions on a government delivering real results? Even the World Bank, usually cautious, quietly praised local initiatives in energy and education emerging from the Sahel. The lines were blurring. Because what Burkina Faso represented now was not a threat, but a precedent. If a landlocked, resource-strained nation under pressure could resist collapse and instead spark cohesion, then the foundations of neo-colonial influence were not just cracked, they were crumbling. And so, while Ibrahim Traoré news headlines remained cautious in tone, the subtext was unmistakable. A shift was underway. Not declared, but demonstrated. Not orchestrated from abroad, but built from within. So if ECOWAS no longer sets the rules, who does? The flag of the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, may still be young, but its meaning is ancient. It stands for a principle long whispered in freedom songs, prayed over in ancestral rites, and now finally declared in policy. Africa will not be defined by dependency. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger did not simply reject ECOWAS. They stepped into the unknown with clarity. They declared in one voice that sovereignty is not a favor, it is a right. Their alliance, though imperfect, has ignited a fire in the hearts of those who have long questioned the status quo. And that fire burns brightest in the eyes of the old and the young alike. In community gatherings across the Sahel, elders speak not in despair, but in defense. They recall days before foreign missions, before loan conditions, when African nations tried, however clumsily, to shape their own futures. Now they see a new generation picking up the thread, not in rebellion, but in reconstruction. Captain Ibrahim Traoré is not worshipped, he is watched closely, judged not by his speeches but by his schools, his clinics, his refineries, his ability to deliver without delay, to lead without spectacle. For many, he represents a prototype, a leader who chooses service over show and institutions over image. He has not promised utopia. The threats remain. Extremist violence still shadows villages, inflation tugs at the cost of survival, global pressures mount. But what Traoré has done, quietly daily, is redefine what's possible. And that possibility is contagious. Talks are already underway to expand AES to include economic harmonization, educational exchanges, and joint infrastructure. Plans once dismissed as fantasies are being redrafted in real time. A regional railway, a shared health network, even the idea of a Sahel-wide satellite for telecommunications, homegrown, locally governed. None of this will be easy. The enemies of sovereignty do not sleep. Media narratives will attempt to twist every misstep into proof of failure. External powers will dangle support that smells like control. Internal divisions may test the strength of new unions. But something irreversible has begun. And this moment belongs not just to presidents or policymakers, but to the people, especially those who have lived long enough to know what it means to see Africa rise, fall, and rise again. You, our elders, carry the memory of betrayal and the wisdom of resilience. This new chapter needs both, because Burkina Faso news is no longer just about crisis. It is about creation, and so the stage is set. But who will be brave enough to walk it next? It began with 9 words. There is undeniable progress in Burkina Faso. Not shouted, not celebrated, just spoken. And yet those words broke more than diplomatic silence. They cracked open the very frame through which Africa had long been viewed, fragile, failing, forever needing. But Burkina Faso refused to fit that frame. And in doing so, it didn't just change its path. It changed the conversation. We have walked together through dusty markets once emptied by fear, now overflowing with food. Through classrooms once abandoned, now echoing with lessons not imported but homegrown. Through solar grids in desert villages, chalk slogans in rural towns, and refineries where gold no longer disappears into foreign vaults, but remains finally in African hands. These are not symbols of charity. They are signatures of change. And the man at the helm, Ibrahim Traoré, is not a miracle. He is a message. That leadership can be humble. That service can be sincere. That independence is not a flag raised, but a system built. He may not be perfect, but in a continent often held hostage by perfection's illusion, he is undeniably real. So what now? For the first time in decades, African nations face a choice not imposed from abroad, but rising from within. To follow the blueprint of sovereignty drawn in Burkina Faso, or remain chained to comforts that come with a cost. To the elders watching, who once dreamed of this very shift, your dream is breathing. To the youth, your future is being rewritten, not by decree but by example. This is no longer about one country. It is about momentum. And so, if you believe that Ibrahim Traoré news is more than just updates, if you believe it is a mirror, a map, a model, then do not sit quietly. If this story lit something inside you, don't scroll past. Like it, share it, speak it. Subscribe, because the louder we tell our story, the harder it is for history to ignore us again. Leave your voice in the comments. Let the world hear. Africa rise. Africa new. we build our future. This is only the beginning.